Hey everybody, I'm Ezekiel and welcome to the shop. Today in this part of the Donated Trumpet series, we are going to break down the entire horn and get all of the valve slides off of it, as well as the sanding and the aesthetic portions of this project done. So let's just jump right into it and I'll show you how I keep all of those things consistent and ready for the final assembly in the next part. So first things up, you can just see the general condition of some of this finish and how kind of scratched up it is. There aren't a whole lot of dents in these slides. They still operate, but they do need cleaned up. And the first thing up is getting the valve caps removed. So I attempt to get these off by just hammering around them. I'm using a nylon hammer to make light taps in the direction that the thread would release. That doesn't work very well, so now I add some valve oil to it to try to penetrate into the thread, continue tapping around to see if that will work. This process usually is pretty slow, but it is good to use because it doesn't damage the threads. Now that these need a little more persuasion, I just add a little heat to the mix. There's still valve oil in there, and I heat up the valve cap only and then continue tapping around lightly in the direction that the thread would release from. Remember, these didn't loosen up after the bath that we gave this initially, so I know these are on there quite well, and I need to go through this heating up process and hitting it lightly with this hammer several times. Now I grab a paper towel, dip it in some water just so I can attempt to pull these off by hand, and here you can see me attempt to do that. No surprise to me, these start to come off and the threads actually look quite intact. There's not even that much grime in them. They just needed to be loosened. Here I do an initial cleaning of the small amount of gunk that is in there. I just add some valve oil and then use a Q-tip to really get down into the valleys of those threads and remove all of the gunk. Now I'll set the valve casing up in the vise with the cloth and light pressure just to hold it enough for me to sand this ferrule. I'm going to leave this ferrule on during this process and leave it on ultimately because that will help the belt installation process later go more smoothly. As you can see, I've got a small piece of sandpaper that I'm using just to work back and forth. This kind of fine control really makes sure that I don't get sandpaper on any of the other parts that I don't want to remove finish from right now. Now I need to start removing all of these extra parts that are on there, so I'll start with the braces that are connected to the second valve slide. Again, just heating them up lightly with this micro torch in a very localized area, and then I pull them off. Now I'll take a Q-tip and heat up just that extra solder, remove that quickly, and make sure that area is clean for the next step. Here I remove the brace on the other side, and this process is exactly the same. Again, just heating it up lightly with this microtorch, heating up the extra solder, removing it with a fresh Q-tip head, and making sure that it's clean for when I go back to solder these pieces on later. Now I'm deciding which part to take off next. I get the brace that connects the first slide to the bell tail. That it only has one point of connection, so it comes off rather quickly. Then I move on to the brace that connects the two first valve slide legs. This requires just a bit more persuasion as it has 2 points of contact, and when you move to one from the other, they tend to cool down just a little bit. Here you can see me using this slide tube expander trick. I use this a lot because it grabs onto the slide leg evenly across its circumference rather than just grabbing it with flat nose pliers that will create a flat spot in that tube. Much more work to remove that. This is a much easier way to remove it safely. Now I remove the brace that will ultimately connect to the upper tuning slide receiver. Then I move on to the brace that connects the bottom tuning slide leg receiver to the third valve slide. And it's here that I notice that the slide legs are moving when they shouldn't be because they're supposed to be soldered on at this point. So they clearly were very old and the solder had tinned and just let loose of itself. This happens sometimes and they come off very easily. I'll have to clean up those areas later so that new solder will hold them on properly. So here's what the raw valve casing looks like. All of the slides are removed except for the second valve tuning slides and that ferrule. But now all the knuckles are exposed, and here later in the video I'll be cleaning up those areas that have old solder on them, because new solder needs to connect to both the fresh brass and the nickel ferrule, not old solder, otherwise it won't stick very well. Now I'm just setting up to break down these third valve slide legs because they came off together rather than separately like I was planning on. So I use the other leg of the third valve slide to remove that top slide, as I didn't want to use the slide expander because it's already holding onto the other one. And it's at this point that we move into the infamous sanding portion of the video. You can kind of catch that glimpse. I have the respirator on again. This process takes a long time, and as I didn't remove the lacquer chemically beforehand, I'm creating a lot of lacquer dust as well as the sandpaper dust, so I don't want to get that in my lungs. So I just use the respirator, but this process does take quite a while. I'm rotating the slide about a quarter of the way, so I use about 3 to 4 turns to get the finish that I want. Then I take a Scotch-Brite pad, do that twisting motion, and this clouds up the finish in a nice aesthetic way. And again, I turn the part several times so that I make sure that it's even across the entire part. Then I clean up the residue and the sandpaper dust with some Goof Off, again not a sponsor, and here's what that looks like. I don't intend to re-lacquer this horn, and this Scotch-Brite finish actually holds up very well in raw brass form and patinas very nicely over time. Here you can see probably the worst finish on this horn, which is this first valve tuning slide leg, and it's got lots of scale buildup, and I'll remove that now through the same sanding process. Again, this takes several turns, rotations of that part to get all of the scratch lines kind of in the same direction. Here there was a bit too much solder left on this part, so I heat it up and remove it, as this would just take way too much sanding to remove through that process. That actually saves a lot of time to get the solder layer as thin as possible before you sand. This process is exactly the same for all 5 slide legs, so I won't show you every slide leg here, but again, it's just sanding, rotating, and using that linear motion with the arm twisting on the Scotch-Brite pad, then removing the excessive amount of dust and stuff with the Goof Off. After all of that sanding process, this is what those 5 legs look like. A much improved finish from their starting point. As you can see, there is a loss of lacquer on these valve caps, so I decided to remove the rest of it through sanding off the rest of it again. Sanding to remove this has the benefit of not using chemicals, which can be harmful and expensive sometimes, though there are ways to use them safely. I just don't want to use them in my space. So it has that benefit, but also it lends to a nice aesthetic to the horn after you're done. But some of the obvious drawbacks are that it takes more time and that it creates a lot of dust that you need to protect yourself from. Now I'll buff these valve caps. This removes any small amount of lacquer that was left after the sanding, as well as really brushing out that aesthetic that I'm trying to get with these valve caps in particular. They should be brighter than the cloudiness of the rest of the horn. Here I am just taking the important step of laying out all the parts that I'll need in the next part of the series, as well as taking my time to assess which parts of this valve casing need to have any dents removed or additional solder removed from those contact points. Now I'll set the valve casing back up into the vise lightly and get into the sanding process for these knuckles. So I'm using a very small piece of sandpaper and trying to remove just the area that will have the fresh solder put into it. I'm trying to use long drawing motions that will keep the sandpaper strip as parallel as possible so I don't go off into parts of the horn that I don't want to be sanded. And here you can see what that fresh brass looks like now that it's exposed. Again, this is essential for the solder to really take hold to the part and the part that it's attaching, because if it wasn't fresh brass, then it would be sticking to old solder, which is very unreliable. The sanding also revealed a small dent that I need to take care of, as you can see right there. So to do that, I need a special tool called a knuckle dent removal tool. And here it is. It has a dent ball attached to the end of it, and I will use it to persuade that brass to get out. I try it just by hand, but decide I can't get quite enough pressure or the right angle, so I use the vise, and I need to use my V-block to get the right kind of 3-point contact on this tool. So I set that up, and now I use the positioning of my body and rotating the valve casing to use light body weight pressure to persuade that brass to move up. I need a little bit of Vaseline to make sure that it runs smoothly, and then again applying light pressure. I'm taking real care here because it's on the knuckle. This material is traditionally very soft and not very thick, so you can easily damage this part beyond repair. Here you can see that is now removed, but again the knuckle is very soft and it's gone a little bit out of round. So I will correct that now with the slide tube expanding tool. I make sure to set that up in the vise. Again, it's in a position where it's kind of locked against the bottom of the vise. I add Vaseline, grab a dent hammer, and start applying some pressure with this dent hammer, as well as expanding that slide tool so that it will be right against the wall of that tubing. So I correct the roundness of that, and then I notice that the other knuckles also need to be corrected a little bit, brought back into round, and I just do that by expanding the slide tool and lightly rotating them around. Most of them don't need any of the dent hammer persuasion. Well, that's that for this part of the Donated Trumpet series. We got all of the valve slides cleaned up and ready for their final assembly, which we'll handle in the next part and final part in this series. In the meantime, if you want to be notified when I post more videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Thanks for stopping by the shop.